I'm joined today by a number of researchers who recently undertook some interesting and informative research looking to learn lessons around land and housing in Europe. This is part of a series of work that makes up the Commission's review of land for housing. Before we get into discussing the detail of the work, I'll introduce each of the researchers. Madhu Satsangi from Glasgow University.
Hello, yes, my name is Madhu Satsangi and I'm a lecturer in urban studies at Glasgow University. My research career has been largely about housing provision and housing need and demand. A particular focus on rural areas, though I have done plenty of work in measuring need, for example, in cities. So that's me.
And Phil O'Brien from Glasgow.
Yeah, so I'm Phil O'Brien. I'm a lecturer in real estate at the University of Glasgow. My research is mainly focused on housing and planning, and I'm especially interested in the combination of public and private resource and policy within that.
And finally, Seb.
My name is Sebastian Dembski. I'm a lecturer in planning at the University of Liverpool, and I've specialized in comparative planning studies, looking at planning systems in Europe. And I studied and was born in Germany and lived and studied and worked for another 10 years in the Netherlands as well.
Great, thanks very much. Well, the research was commissioned by the Land Commission because there's a concern that in Scotland we're not delivering enough housing to meet need and demand, and also there's concerns about the quality of place that's being created on new developments. So really, as a starter for discussion, I wondered if you could say a little bit about what we found when comparing Scotland to the 3 European countries.
Okay, thanks. Well, if I can start off the discussion on that point, I think you're absolutely right, David, that those concerns in Scotland and indeed in the other nations of the UK are to a certain extent quite distinct positions that in our near European neighbours, that degree of discontent doesn't emerge. However, behind that then are firstly an issue of difference in that the persistent problems apparently for local planning authorities in delivering sufficient quantities of housing tenuously in the places that they are needed characterise the Scottish debate, and in terms of when we look at place quality, then the difficulty of achieving that seems to be a persistent feature of the debate. However, there are also some similarities between particularly Scotland and some of our northern, northwest European neighbours, where we see commonalities in the number of houses that are in flats and in style in which flats are produced, and the low-rise, if you like, developments in tenements that characterise particularly the cities. We also have similarities in the numbers of houses in the private rental sector.
That's very helpful, thank you, Madhu. Now, the research also looked in quite a bit of detail at 3 particular European countries, so I wondered if you could say a little bit of what the particular lessons were from each of these?
Yeah, so before we go to the lessons, I think it's quite good to provide a quick overview. I think the planning systems have quite a lot in common. Each of them have their own specific instruments, and there are differences in emphasis, but it's important to know that all three countries, there's evidence of a very active role of local authorities in land assembly. And they also have very similar instruments in helping them, including preemption rights, so to give them priority access on the land market, land readjustment to make plots which are not suitable for development to make them suitable. They all have instruments in terms of land value capture and public cost recovery, so that the costs for the public sector can be recovered. There is, and even they have the kind of most intense instruments of building orders or compulsory purchase as instruments of last resort to break impasses. All have zoning-based instruments, and that's where which means that a planning application which is in conformance with a plan will be honored. But all of them also have planning instruments, land policy instruments that intervene in property rights, and which allows them also to allocate, assemble, and deliver housing land. So I think one of the findings, or it's not a single instrument which works, but it's a combination of instruments and how they're used. So the lessons which we're thinking we found are actually not at the level of specific instruments, but to show how these planning systems have addressed very different challenges and have managed to cope with it.
Yeah.
So we're giving now a few trying to summarize a snapshot of kind of a specific change where a planning system has coped with and how the instruments played a role in this.
So if I kick off with the Netherlands case, if we look at sort of a transition that's taken since the 90s, looking at planning in the Netherlands in the long term, so since the war, between the end of the war and about the middle of the 1990s, the Netherlands was producing the vast majority of its new housing through public land development delivered through an active land policy. So what we mean by those two terms would be that public land development would be the public purchase of land, so acquisition, assembly, land development, so installation of infrastructure, division of land into plots, and of course the production of a land use plan, from which entails the granting of planning permission to those plots, and then the sale of plots to private developers. The implications of this then are that, well, for one thing, in terms of land value capture, municipalities who are conducting an active land policy are able to capture land value increase that's resulted from the award of planning permission and from the installation of infrastructure. In terms of the kind of locations and the nature of new housing and the quality of places produced, we're generally looking at quite sort of substantial greenfield developments produced in a really sort of coherent way, and in a really kind of integrated way. So integrated into the city that they're a part of, but also integrated within themselves with sufficient kind of shops and services, almost kind of complete new developments. So there are really strong commonalities with the new towns policy in the UK. Differences being that in the Netherlands, we're not talking about developments the size of new towns, much smaller developments, and that the policy is conducted by municipalities rather than sort of some equivalent of new towns corporations or development agencies. In terms of kind of both the quantity of new housing and the quality of new housing, well, municipalities in the Netherlands are bound by agreement with central government to produce sufficient new housing to provide for growing population. And in terms of quantity of new housing produced, public land development was actually very successful. In terms of quality, it might be criticised from the perspective of the kind of a relative kind of uniformity of new development. That's partly due to the fact that we're talking about, as I said, quite large individual developments, and partly due to the fact that the house building industry in the Netherlands is relatively similar in structure to that of the UK. So there are quite a few very large builders. I guess the difference would be in the public land developments, or through an active land policy, that large developers are buying up individual plots. And up until the 90s, housing developers were actually quite happy to do that. Risk was relatively low for them because they're buying service plots that have planning permission attached. So what house builders in the UK refer to as planning risk was pretty much eliminated. And they were making their profits simply through delivery of new housing. By the 90s, things had changed a bit. And there's two kind of motivations, or two drivers of this, rather. One is simply that land values were increasing, largely for the same reasons that they were increasing elsewhere. Perhaps dissimilar to the UK, not so much increasing because of any kind of perceived shortfall in the quantity of new housing, but increasing because, sustained period of rising incomes, low interest rates, a growing preference for owner occupation, pushed up the value of houses and thereby pushed up the value of developable land. So from the 90s, we begin to see house builders think, hang on, okay, there's a risk to buying land that doesn't have planning permission attached. But then again, the gains are commensurately large. So we begin to see sort of speculative activity in the land market, just as we see in the UK from house builders. The other driver is a growing preference at national policy level for building in a more sort of contained way. In the Netherlands, there's just like in the UK, there's quite a strong preference for people to live in relatively low density. So live at relatively low density. So to live in houses rather than in flats. New developments tend to be built in houses at the edge of cities. From the 90s, we saw quite a shift in policy. And this is by no means kind of uniform, but we begin to see this preference for much more compact development on brownfield sites in cities. So there's been a shift as a result then from this kind of broadly practiced active land policy, public land development, towards what's come to be called organic development. This is relatively smaller scale, brownfield, and it's a mix of public and private-led development. I think this is sometimes interpreted in the Netherlands as quite a radical shift towards the private sector. We have to think of that in really kind of relative terms. It's by no means a total shift to the private sector. Now, organic development then it contrasts quite markedly with public land development, and it presents a few challenges for local planning authorities in the Netherlands because they're accustomed to intervening quite directly in land markets and in development and in dictating the shape of new development and new places in a very sort of direct way, not through policy. The way that local planning authorities are dealing with this is partly through policy and partly through direct intervention. They're taking quite a variety of different approaches. They're forming joint ventures with private developers. Crucially, they're able to negotiate the final form of private development. A lot of new development is not led by the planning authority itself. It's led by private developers who propose a development to the planning authority. But the planning authority ultimately has the final say on what gets developed. It's able to produce a legally binding land use plan. As a result, then, it tends to negotiate the final form of development with private developers. As a result, then, there's this possibility of matching the needs of both parties. So we get something that's profitable and meets planning goals, albeit within the constraints of profitability in that particular location. Another thing that's quite common is to take a kind of project management approach. So it's common for local planning authorities to appoint a project manager who brings together landowners and developers. So the local planning authority might sort of pick a preferred site. It might have a sort of strategic site. That doesn't mean that it draws a land use plan around that site. It means that it approaches landowners, asks them what they want from the development, thinks about what kind of profitability what kind of profit they're likely to make, and also speaks to developers who might be involved. So this kind of negotiation between the municipality, the landowner, and the developer is really key. It's key in placemaking because the master plan as a result of the development is effectively a land use plan, a legally binding plan, in which the local planning authority is able to kind of raise the quality of places. And it also kind of extends to land value capture. So there is a legal framework for public cost recovery. But in almost all cases, so in one particular survey over a few years in the late 2000s, the authors found that 97% of cases of cost recovery use private contracts rather than a public cost recovery plan, which indicates that both parties, private and public, prefer to deal with each other through negotiations rather than through a sort of public law. So I guess a summary for the Dutch case would be that it's very much about a sort of mutually beneficial situation in planning and development. And it's achieved through the local planning authority being able to maintain its control over the shape of new developments, but also requiring the private sector to invest.
Thanks, Phil. That's really interesting. I think it's interesting that there's a similar pattern in terms of who does the development in the Netherlands, and also I think in Scotland through NPF4 we're starting to see a move towards wanting more development to be brownfield and infill, so perhaps lessons there for how we can manage that, and maybe how the public sector can play a more active role in making that happen and reducing risk. So of the other two case studies, Sebastian, they were Germany and Switzerland.
The point which Phil made about the development, the collaborative development between private parties and the public sector, that applies very much to the other countries as well. So I wanted to highlight two specific aspects, one for Switzerland and one for Germany. So what is remarkable about Switzerland is actually that it is a country which has effectively applied a brake on land uptake, which in some areas where there's an oversupply of building land even results in rezoning or dezoning. Basically, building land will be changed into agricultural or back into the building rights will be taken away even. So it's very remarkable that the majority of the Swiss electorate voted for a change in planning law in a public referendum, which basically reduces the land uptake to zero. So it's a very strong attitude to preventing sprawl, and that is even more remarkable that this takes place in a country which has experienced really substantial population growth with 1% per year, or roughly 20% over 2 decades. So, and how is this managed? Is interesting. It's managed via regional plans, which limit the possibilities for local authorities and local plans, and the regional plans are approved by the Swiss government. So it's a hierarchical system to some extent in terms of approving plans to make sure that they don't have unnecessary building land reserves. So and if they have too much, as I said, they're really legally obliged to reduce it, because the plan will not be approved by the higher tier government. So that's the restrictive element, but it's also interesting to see how at all levels of government, so at the national, federal level, at the cantonal level, and at the local authority level, they're working on densification, on making sure that housing supply is sufficient. So densification is the catchword for Swiss local authorities, or Swiss planning at the moment. They're identifying areas for transformation, for which they will draw up a special land use plan, for instance. And this will be similar as Phil described for the Netherlands. It will be drawn up to jointly in collaboration with landowners and developers. And it works because densification means higher land values, and that makes it appealing for landowners because there is because of higher densities provide more profits. At the same time, the increase in land value uplift pays for placemaking, including the public infrastructure. Now, the German case is a different one. I think the Land Commission has previously commissioned some work to look in particular at land readjustment in Germany. Germany is quite remarkable for this specific instrument, but it's also actually it has a very complete planning system. I mentioned at the beginning the whole range of instruments, and in Germany they're quite developed and in the Federal Building Code. But Germany had for a long time had no growth whatsoever in terms of population, a very stable population. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, the economy wasn't doing too well. So it was managing very well with this land readjustment instrument. So it is generally described as a very successful instrument because it benefits the landowner and the local authority. So it allows to supply serviced land without compulsory purchase. So just to briefly explain how it works, land is pooled, it's then serviced and returned to the owner as building land. And it is so each owner owns less land because the local authority takes away land for public infrastructure, but the owner has more valuable land. So in that sense, it is a win-win situation. But it's also a passive instrument which worked very well in this economic and demographic context which I described, because it's passive because implementation is not part of the deal and cannot be made part of the deal. So it works particularly well in the urban fringes of and for individual or small-scale house builders. Since 5 to 10 years, Germany experiences very, very high pressures on in particular in metropolitan areas, overheated housing markets, and it was a really new situation. But it's the same planning instruments which were always there, which are could be applied under these conditions. So there are very quite radical instruments in the planning system which have high financial risks for the local authorities as well. But under high growth scenarios, these risks are much more manageable or defendable for local authorities. So the urban development measure is a radical instrument which needs to be justified by, for instance, very large housing need. And in contrast to mandatory land readjustment, the local authority acquires the land or a developer on its behalf at existing use value, so at a relatively low price. It is serviced and then it's at least offered to back to the original landowner or sold on the market for development. And that includes an implementation paragraph, a building order. So they have a broad range of instruments for very different situations because they're for high growth areas and equally instruments where there's very little pressure to develop. And I think that these are good examples to show that planning systems have been able to cope with very different circumstances, but they had a stable set of instruments which have been applied differently or used differently throughout the decades.
Yeah, really interesting, the Swiss example and the idea that actually limiting land use and focusing on brownfield sites can actually lead to some benefits, land value uplift for the developer, but, the creation of better places and better infrastructure in the public interest. And secondly, the German research, very interesting for the Land Commission, the range of, I suppose, land assembly mechanisms and ways of bringing forward land for development. If I could now move on and ask, do you feel as researchers that there's perhaps a common theme or approach to land for housing in the case study countries and something that Scotland could learn from?
So, as Sebastian's talked about a bit more than me, there are various different kind of instruments that each country uses, and maybe most obviously Germany has this quite flexible array of instruments that it can use for different sorts of areas with different levels of demand and different sorts of levels of land supply. The one thing that all three planning systems have really sort of obviously got in common is that they all operate a zonal planning system. But in contrast to what I think a lot of us in Britain understand as being a zonal planning system, there isn't a kind of zonal plan prepared for the whole of the city plus wider areas where growth is likely to happen, such that development proposals have to be in conformance with that plan. What actually happens is that development is usually not really plan-led. It tends to be development-led. It tends to be the case that there is no plan prepared for growth areas. Instead, a development proposal comes about. It might be from the private sector. It might be from a landowner. It might be from the public sector. And then a land use plan is kind of negotiated between public and private sectors. So I talked about this a bit about in the cases of the Netherlands. It's true in all three cases. As a result, then what we kind of get is a form of zonal planning, which is actually development-led. So you get the kind of the benefit of public control over the shape and form of new development. And that comes about because the local planning authority has that trump card of the legally binding land use plan. It can refuse planning permission if it likes. It can control the shape of the new plan. Combined with the fact that development is ultimately, generally speaking, led by the market. And ultimately, the benefit is this kind of these two interests coming together. We get the mixture of the fact that it's the market ultimately bringing forward land and the fact that it's the local planning authority ultimately determining levels of placemaking, albeit within the constraints of profitability. So there's this kind of mutual incentivization between public and private sectors. The fact that the local planning authority has the right to make the plan forces private developers into taking a collaborative approach. But equally, the fact that the local planning authority relies on the private sector to provide investment and to undertake development forces it into collaboration. There's also a kind of land value capture implication to this, which is that if private sector developers know that the local planning authority, A, will require quite a high standard of placemaking, and B, will make this ultimately a legal requirement, then private developers can factor this into their land bids. They can bid less for land, and they can then, so we can see that what's ultimately in Scotland a windfall gain to the landowner, that windfall gain can be channeled into placemaking. So when done well, this doesn't have a negative effect on the house builder, albeit it does reduce the level of the windfall gain for the landowner. What we also see in all three cases is this kind of very flexible attitude as to where development proposals come from. So it could be that, so in the Netherlands, for example, municipalities, or most municipalities, still do operate an active land policy. They still do buy land, bank land. They still do want to own strategic sites. However, you also get lots of private sector developer proposals. You'll get lots of cases where joint ventures come about, where interests align between public and private sectors. So those joint ventures, I guess, are just another manifestation of this mutually incentivized negotiation between public and private sectors. Sebastian, I don't know if you want to talk a bit.
I wanted to just say one minor addition to the point. I think in terms of the collaborative versus the adversarial planning system, so the UK systems, so Scotland and England, are quite often perceived as adversarial. That just can't happen, because as a developer, there is no interest in taking the local authority to court, because it has to provide the land use plan, and the developer has no right to get a land use plan which is tailored to its needs. Once the land use plan is in place, the local authority has to provide planning permission. But to get to this stage is usually it is one step further. So the real legal conflicts are usually by those who are affected by a land use plan, like environmental organization, residents, and the local authority rather than the developer and the local authority. But one thing what we also saw that is not so much related, it's related to it because it is enabled through this power of local authorities. But what we have seen in the 3 smaller projects which we have looked at was also the role of urban design and urban design competitions in improving the placemaking quality. So all 3, we have looked at 3 projects in cities, and all of them used some form of a design competition of reputable consultancies. And Germany was actually quite insightful because it doesn't have a tradition of design competitions like the Netherlands, but they're using them more and more. And the local authority was bold enough to require an urban design competition. And it was quite interesting to see this, the reflection of the developer and the local planning officer on this process. So the developer wasn't really wanting to have a design competition. They were against it initially, or skeptical, as he would have described it. But there were afterwards, the developer in particular was really convinced about the results. It had really generated added value. And when you look at the total costs, it was a housing development of 200 units or so, and the price to invite 5 planning consultancies or architectural consultancy to come up with a design was 50,000 euros. So it's actually on the effect on the overarching costs was really limited, and potentially the better quality design and has even overcompensated that. So in the end, they were both very happy actually that this urban design was used, and it has really produced great results. The framework for the competition was obviously mutually agreed, and they decided jointly on the winning design, and was they used invited design competitions, so you have different forms of design competitions. So actually the planning officers in all cases were preferring invited competitions rather than the highest architectural competitions which actually afterwards almost forces you to implement the winning design. So but there's a range of design competitions which can really improve the outcomes of the plan and create a competition of ideas.
Yeah, so a real emphasis, I think, from all the case study countries on placemaking, land value, uplift capture, and just quality of design. I find this a really interesting discussion. I think there's a lot to learn from the research, and actually the timing's great. We'll be publishing the findings from our review of land for housing in the next 6 weeks, and we'll draw heavily on the research. And we're also looking forward to the Housing to 2040 route map from the Scottish Government. And again, I think there's a lot to learn for that. So it just remains for me to thank you all for taking part in the discussion and for carrying out the research.
And can I say thank you, David, and to the Land Commission for us. I think it was a win-win situation that we were involved in a piece of research which was very much gelled with our interests, and doing the research, the desk-based review, and the detailed case studies really allowed us that freedom to get an up-to-date handle on what's happening in new housing development and trends in that, and what's happening in terms of the evolving powers of planning, and how planning and developers can be working in ultimately what feels like at the end quite consensual and ideal in that perspective outcomes, whilst recognizing that actually getting there means a lot of negotiation, but probably some quite difficult conversations as we get there.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.